It's a week of great expectations for Donald Trump, who right now is en route to Vietnam, where preparations are underway for his second summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un. Here's what he had to say this morning, just as he was leaving.
Tremendous things are happening for our country. I think we'll have a very tremendous summit. We want denuclearization.
The president is expected to press Kim to freeze all missile programs, to agree on a common definition of denuclearization, and to finally issue a formal declaration to end the Korean War. But while Trump is building up anticipation, his own Secretary of State is trying to tamp it down.
We've got work to do on the denuclearization. A demonstrable, verifiable step is something that I know President Trump is very focused on achieving.
And it's not the first time Trump has seen things with North Korea differently than his advisors. After his first summit with Kim last June, he tweeted, "Everybody can now feel much safer than the day I took office. There is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea." But at the hearing before Congress last month, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats categorically disagreed.
We currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival.
So, it's on to Hanoi. Joining me is former Undersecretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Nicholas Burns. He now teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Great to see you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jim. Nice to be here.
So we know the nuclear threat was not eradicated after Singapore in June or whatever it was. Was any progress made on the nuclear front out of that first summit?
I think a little bit. And I think, first of all, President's right to turn to diplomacy. We weren't getting anywhere in the war of words. Remember in 2017, people were worried about a war. The North Koreans have not conducted a nuclear test, which is significant since they met in Singapore. The North Koreans are pledging that they're going to commit to denuclearization, but they haven't agreed on the bottom line. I think that's the key issue, Jim. They haven't done as much as they should have by now. And the President needs to have, I think, some discernible, specific commitments from the North Koreans coming out of Hanoi.
But what you said, there's been no new testing since. We have no idea if there's been production since.
There's been no nuclear tests.
Okay, yeah, right.
You know, but we assume the North Koreans have continued their research to develop nuclear weapons, including eventually a nuclear weapon that could reach the continental United States.
So what should be Donald Trump's goals in Hanoi?
I think you've got to look at this as a negotiation that'll take years. The President needs to do something, convince them to do something, to begin to identify where their nuclear weapons are, where the fissile material is, the components of a nuclear weapon. That's where you start in a negotiation. And then to convince the North Koreans that discernible, specific steps need to be taken, like beginning to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. That's where they process plutonium. And that's one of the avenues towards a nuclear weapon.
What do we have to offer? End of sanctions? I mean, what's enough for him to end, arguably, his most valuable possession vis-a-vis the world?
This is going to be the most difficult thing for the President, for any negotiator with the North Koreans. They're looking for end to sanctions, or at least relief from sanctions. They're looking for Kim to be able to emerge from isolation. They want to diminish the American troop presence on the Korean Peninsula, and we shouldn't give him any of that. We've got the leverage right now. He's a young dictator. He's an authoritarian leader. He's going to be impressed, I think, if we're tough-minded in these negotiations, and we insist he deliver first. I'm not sure our president's in that frame of mind. We'll see this week.
You know, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador, but didn't we set all these preconditions for any negotiations with Iran? But we don't seem to be setting any preconditions for negotiations with North Korea. If I'm right, why? What would the Trump people say was the distinction between the two?
I think they'd say that the President decided to begin this at his level, not at the Assistant Secretary of State level or even the Secretary of State level. And so you had this meeting in Singapore, which it made sense to get a sense of what he was like, Kim Jong Un, and what he wants out of these negotiations.
First president to meet with him, you should say, yeah.
First senior American after Secretary Pompeo to meet with him. In fact, you know, Dennis Rodman had been the only American who'd really spent a lot of time with this guy before.
But what's if I'm Kim, I say, I gave up virtually nothing, maybe actually nothing, in the first meeting, and Donald Trump still went home and said it was a great success. Yeah. So if he's going to do the same thing, which in all likelihood he will, after round two, why do I need to give anything this time either?
And that might very well be his frame of mind coming into the meeting. So our president needs to say, no further sanctions, no sanctions relief whatsoever. We're not going to have any kind of peace agreement to end the Korean War. It ended in an armistice in 1953. We're not going to open up to you unless you show us proof that you're serious. Because remember, Jim, President Clinton had an agreement with the North Koreans, the grandfather and father, in 1994 and 5. It worked for a number of years. The North Koreans violated it. President George W. Bush had an agreement. The North Koreans violated it. So we've got to have our eyes open here, and the president needs to be steely.
Can we go, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9,000 miles to the east if we can? I think that's roughly how far. Thousands of miles to Venezuela. It is rare in the 2 years that Donald Trump has been president of the United States, at least in my estimation, he's been on the right side of a humanitarian crisis, millions of people fleeing Venezuela. He seems to be on the right side here, but is it because he actually cares about those people, or as John Bolton was candid enough to say, I think on Fox News, it's all about the oil reserves? What is it about?
I think it's about one of the most important countries in Latin America, right on the doorstep to the United States. Traditionally in the past, the distant past, a friend of the United States, about trying to help that country because it's bleeding. I mean, the enormous loss of, people leaving the country, refugees in Colombia and the United States itself, the loss of income, the suffering on the streets. This is one of the most serious economic declines in modern history. And so I think the president is on the right side of this. The U.S. is doing the right things, with one exception, Jim. Donald Trump's trying to lead the parade. He's trying to be the face of this opposition to the Maduro regime.
Latin American countries should be leading, and we should be part of
Much
that.
better to have a Colombian or Brazilian leader of this.
Well, at least to their credit, Pence, the vice president, is in Colombia trying to organize some sort of a coalition. Here he is this morning speaking about the ouster of Maduro.
What brings us together today is the recognition by all the nations gathered here that Nicolas Maduro is a usurper with no legitimate claim to power. And Nicolas Maduro must go.
Is there universal recognition that Maduro has to go?
Not universal, but the key countries in Latin America, Brazil and Colombia, agree on that. Many countries in Europe agree on that. The Nicaraguans and the Cubans are still defending him. In the endgame like this, when you've got somebody on the ropes, it might be best to try to convince him privately to leave. This kind of showdown like this, he might just stand and fight. It's hard to know what the final ending of this is going to be, but hopefully a disappearance of a withdrawal of Maduro from the political scene, and this new government led by Guaido.
Well, what would cause him to disappear in your estimation? I mean, beyond this mass exodus, to see and hear about this humanitarian aid being set on fire at the border is so
tragic.
sadistic. It is just so. What do we do to get to the point where he decides it's in his personal self-interest?
The military in Venezuela is going to have to turn against him, and hopefully then Maduro will make the calculation that the only way he can get out of this is to leave and to go into exile, and then you try to effect a peaceful transition, and that's going to take Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the U.S. will all have to be involved.
You don't think that the Trump administration is crazy enough to be talking about some military intervention here, do you, or do you?
It would be a disaster, because it would be the greatest gift we could give to Nicolas Maduro. We should stay out of that country militarily.
But will
try
we?
to convince him to leave. I think we will.
You know, I want to make one more transition. You were in Munich.
I was.
For the security conference. I saw your photograph with introducing or interviewing Joe Biden.
I introduced former Vice President Biden. I interviewed him. Yes.
So, well, the takeaway for most Americans who were not lucky enough to be in Munich was this moment with the same Vice President Pence. Here he is.
I bring greetings from the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
Did we make too much? I mean, total silence. Not one. I mean, it's obviously a sort of a throwaway applause line. Nobody applauded in the whole room. Did we make too much of that, or is that a statement about how our allies feel about us?
Well, it's a really sad moment for the United States when our president's introduced and no one applauds, not even the Americans in the room, the members of Congress in the room. Our relationship with Europe right now is at a crisis point because President Trump is supporting anti-democratic leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary over the democratic leaders, Chancellor Merkel, Emmanuel Macron. He hasn't been a good leader of NATO. He's campaigned against the European Union, which we, of course, helped to set up and develop over the last 70 years. We have a crisis point. The president is the first American president since the Second World War who hasn't supported a strong transatlantic link. When I was in Munich and saw what happened to Vice President Pence, and then saw Chancellor Merkel give a very firm speech opposing President Trump's policies.
How was she received?
She received a standing ovation. And Vice President Biden, whom I introduced, received a standing ovation for saying this, Jim: the United States should support NATO, the United States should support our economic partnership with the EU, and we're friends with Europe. That's all Vice President Biden had to say to get a standing ovation.
How long were you with him, Biden?
Well, he was on the stage for about an hour.
Is he running?
I don't know. I hope he does. I think he'd be a very good.
Do you really not know, or you just not telling me?
I really don't know,
Okay.
but I hope he does run. I think he'd be a very fine president.
It's great to see you. Thanks so much
Jim.
for your time. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it, Nicholas Burns.